Thank you so much. It's good to be here virtually. And I would have loved to have been there in person, but heading out to a bunch of meetings this week, and so very glad to be able to do this via Zoom. So I did figure it's lunch, so in my mind I was picturing you while, in fact, I see you're munching egg sandwiches while listening to me. So I thought very worst thing I could do is bring you a PowerPoint today. So I thought perhaps what I could contribute is a few opening reflections on where we're at as climate change advocates in Canada at the moment, and then kick it over to you, and let's have a great rousing lunchtime discussion on this important topic. You just for starters, maybe I'll just extrapolate a little bit about what you've heard of the Canadian Climate Institute. And let me begin by saying that I'm very grateful to many academics, leaders in the University of Waterloo community for either being there for our launch, participating in our launch five short years ago, or in fact, continuing to participate in our expert panels. So Blair Feltmate and the Intact Center were there right at the beginning. Very grateful to Blair for his early leadership on our expert panels at the moment. Jean Andre, Juan Moreno-Cruz, Dan Henstra, great University of Waterloo academics. A lot of our work all of our work is informed by three permanently constituted expert panels populated with climate change experts from around the country, and focused on our three key areas of work. Somewhat unusually for research organizations in the climate change space, we have one focus. We've three primary areas of focus: mitigation, adaptation, and clean growth. So when it comes to climate change policy, we really try to cover the waterfront and find those threads in the argument between mitigation and adaptation and some of these I think silos that have developed within the climate change research community. We try to function. One of our functions across the country is really a network of climate change experts trying to brainstorm together, move forward together in the interests of effective climate change policy. So I think my piece in the Star from a few weeks ago was circulated, so feel free to check that out. But I'm going to touch on each of the points I made in that column, because I suspect that many people in this actual and virtual room, like me, have been waking up every morning over the last couple of months, occasionally disheartened at what we're hearing in the realm of climate policy from south of the border, and trying to grapple on a daily basis with what this means for our work as researchers and advocates in this area, interested in progress on emission reduction, adaptation progress. What is the election of Donald Trump and a Republican majority and the very confusing daily announcements mean for our work here in Canada? So I want to begin here with kind of a broader reflection on this very strange and volatile moment. And then I'll end with a couple of reflections on where we're at in terms of climate change policy in Canada. So in a nutshell, my submission to you about what's happening south of the border is there's a tendency with Canadian media to overreact to Donald Trump's climate change pronouncements. And for at least four reasons, I think I remain optimistic that despite the new president's clear hostility to climate change policy, or in fact, I would submit common sense in the climate change realm, There remain a number of reasons why we should remain optimistic and steadfast in terms of feeling confident in our ability to move forward climate change policy over the next few years. The first is that this won't be news to many University of Waterloo researchers, particularly from the Intact Center. But the first reason that I remain optimistic about our ability to make progress together is that public concern about extreme weather events continues to increase. And as opposed to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, where climate change was a notional concern, to the extent that there was a climate change discussion, the assumption was in the media amongst decision makers that this was a concern for our kids or our grandkids. There was no sense of a proximate threat to the health and welfare of people and communities in the here and now. That is very much changed in a short period of time, unfortunately, because of terrible climate-driven disasters like we see in LA, in Jasper this past summer. And we see increasingly, we know increasingly that these climate-driven effects, flooding, wildfires, their impact can be measured and quantified and expressed in dollars and cents. And so we work very often with insurance companies, with the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and IBC's calculation is that last year, insured losses across Canada, largely due to climate-driven extreme weather, topped $8 billion in 1 year. The cleanup cost, just the initial cleanup for the wildfires in Jasper last year, just shy of $1 billion. I can go province by province, naming expensive disasters last year, flooding, wildfires exacerbated by climate change. Southern Quebec, a couple of days of flooding in late August. The most expensive disaster in Quebec history, topping even the ice storm of more than a decade ago. And so the reality of climate change today, whether in LA or in Quebec or in Jasper, is that unfortunately we know there's a predictability to the destruction unleashed by climate change, and that has its own accelerating effect, its own inbuilt ratcheting effect on the debate. And we don't need to explain anymore to people, most media outlets, most decision makers, that it's not the cost of action on climate change that is costing us. It's the cost of our inaction increasingly that's expensive, and so we need to get a move on. The second reason that I have some optimism, or that we shouldn't be completely disheartened at what's happening in the United States, is that subnational action is intensifying. What we saw in the first Trump presidency, as the U.S. federal level retreated from climate leadership, what we saw is that state level action increased, intensified. And in fact, there's an organization you should check out if you haven't seen it already, the U.S. Climate Alliance. It's 24 states led by California, New York, Illinois, representing about 50% of the U.S. economy and the U.S. population, that formed in the first Trump presidency, have remained organized, and have served notice over the last few weeks that in areas of their jurisdiction, which of course in the United States are substantial, there's substantial state jurisdiction over transportation policy, electricity policy, industrial policy, infrastructure building, that these 24 states have served notice that they are going to hold the line in terms of the Biden era emission reduction targets 2030, and a lot of the advances that have been made over the last few years. And so though a lot of dust obviously needs to settle in terms of litigation in the United States, I think what we're going to see in the United States is essentially a bifurcated market. That's what we see at the moment with cars, where there is a federal tailpipe standard, but um, uh, uh, led by California, about 15 US states have regulated sales targets for electric vehicles. And there's a very good chance that those sorts of initiatives will be able to continue because states have substantial power to regulate in these areas, as do provinces. And so I think what we're going to see in the states, as we did in the first Trump presidency, is accelerated subnational action, which really matters. Of course, if California was a country, it would be the 5th largest economy in the world. And so there is room for continued progress in the United States in these areas. The third reason that I remain optimistic, and frankly, this has really changed since the first Trump presidency, is that the mathematics of the net zero transition are now inescapable. And 2 data points here that I think are particularly interesting. There's really only 2 completely deregulated electricity markets on the continent, Alberta and Texas. Only thing that matters is how much you bid into the system with your project, what the cost of your project is. The up until recently in Alberta, it was really technology agnostic, and really what mattered was the price of electricity that you were able to offer. And lo and behold, in Alberta and Texas, what projects are winning in these deregulated contexts? Solar, wind, batteries, short duration battery storage are all coming out on top because these technologies are so cheap. And so we're in a very different place than we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, where I was involved, for instance, in the early days of the Ontario Green Energy Act. And if you were one of the lucky people that signed a FIT contract in those days and stuck a solar panel on your roof and fed it back into your grid, you were being paid 80 cents a kilowatt hour. Just mind-boggling. And given how cheap solar power is today. And so there's a mathematical inescapability in terms of the fact that if you can get people into an electric vehicle, they're going to save money. If you can get people, actually my furnace failed last week. We've now replaced it with a cold weather heat pump, and we're going to save a lot of money doing that. And actually, my organization has done these calculations across the country. You can check out heatpumpcalculator.ca. We've done the number crunching, and in most places across the country, a heat pump is a much better deal for consumers than natural gas, or indeed a hybrid heat pump natural gas setup. So there's an affordability argument here as well for consumers. The last argument I want to make here in terms of my continued optimism, and maybe this is because I'm a proud Gen Xer, and I've lived through, my children get tired of hearing stories like this, but I've lived through the transition from cassette tapes, or if I'm honest, 8-track tapes, to CDs, to streaming. I've lived through the transition of rotary dial phones to mobiles, from pocket calculators to laptops. And sometimes, and we know this intuitively as consumers, sometimes the new machines are just better. They work better, they're easier to use, they're ergonomically pleasing. And I would submit that we're at that point with heat pumps. We've done these sorts of surveys. Very few people buy a heat pump and say, wow, I really regret buying this heat pump. It is nowhere near as good as I'd hoped. Very few people buy electric vehicles and express disappointment and the desire to go back to internal combustion engines. So this new generation of machines are better. And we know what happens as consumers when the better machines start to catch on. The adoption curve accelerates. And so I think we're at that point with these new machines that are not just better, they also reduce emissions. So I think clearly it's going to be a rocky couple of years. Clearly, our colleagues in California and elsewhere are going to have to duke it out in the courts to maintain their regulatory capabilities. However, I remain convinced that we're going to continue to make progress. There was a German election yesterday. I think the headline out of that election with respect to climate change should have been over 75% of German voters back political parties promising massive climate change progress. The UK is all in. Europe is all in. We work with colleague organizations all across the world, South Africa, Indonesia. The net zero transition is accelerating. Here in Canada, we're making progress. I mean, we at our institute, we hold two ideas in our head at the same time. The first idea is that we need to accelerate the progress. We're not going fast enough. But the second thought is that we are making progress, and our organization measures this on a regular basis. For the first time, we've seen the carbon curve inflect downward in Canada over the last couple of years. Emissions have been reduced by about 8% versus 2005 levels. Interestingly, now we see big differences between industrial sectors. So electricity sector decarbonization since 2005, emissions down about 60% over the past decade, largely through the shutdown of coal plants across the country. We've just started to see some progress in the building sector, in the transportation sector, variable by province. There are some sectors where clearly we need to do work, and we need to pick up the pace in terms of fiscal and regulatory measures. Scope 1 emissions from the oil and gas sector are now fully 30% of Canada's national emissions and trending upwards. And so whatever we're doing with respect to oil and gas is clearly not working in terms of incenting bringing down emissions per barrel. And we need to address that as soon as possible. So maybe I'll leave it there. I work on climate change for a living, and I'm despite the crazy headlines coming out of the US on a daily basis, I'm still feeling pretty optimistic, and I look forward to your questions. Feel free to disagree or agree.